Good morning, everyone. We are on week 18 of Bible Engagement, the Life of Christ. And to catch us, kind of get us on, we're going to be in Mark chapter 1. I'll tell you that to start out with. Mark chapter 1 and 2. We'll be at verse 35 is where we'll start reading here in a minute. Last week, we see that after Jesus had been rejected in Nazareth, he went to Capernaum, was widely accepted in the synagogue. Possessed man in the synagogue. There's a possessed man in the synagogue. Demon recognized who Jesus was. Wait a minute. No, I'm sorry. We're on week 19, and I was reading last week's. Mark chapter 3 is where we're going to be at today. My apologies. Rewind. Start all over again. No, I just didn't go far enough down in my notes. So we're on week 19, and Jesus' ministry in Galilee started out with a rough start in Nazareth. We know that because, they rejected him and then they tried to kill him. But after moving to Capernaum, and he's traveling in that region, Jesus has touched many lives. But even the Galilean ministry has had controversy throughout. And last week, we read the story of the paralyzed man that was lowered down to Jesus through the roof. And Jesus, knowing that this would cause problems in the first place, said, "Your sins be forgiven you." And if you read the story and you realize that, he actually tells you, he said in Mark chapter 2, verse 10, that he said, but I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He knew that the Pharisees that were there were going to have problems with what he said. And of course they said, he can't forgive sins, only God can forgive sins. And the truth of the matter is, they didn't understand who he was, that he is God come in the flesh, and that he has that right, he's the Messiah. So he made that point to say, hey, the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. If you continue reading in Mark chapter 2, past that story, Mark records the calling of Matthew, the tax collector. This also was controversial. Jesus, after calling Matthew, went to his home and ate with him and other tax collectors and sinners. And the Pharisees voiced their concern about Jesus spending time with people like this, to Jesus' disciples, saying, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? So we see that Jesus' ministry was not without controversy. Controversy comes with ministry. It's just part of it. And the hardest part for all of us to understand is that we have to deal with that controversy, and none of us really want to have to deal with it. Jesus was a master of this, obviously, because he's God, and he was able to handle a lot of these things. But the controversies that he had were prophesied to happen in the first place, because he was going to be rejected of men. Those that should have accepted him were the ones who rejected him the most. So now in Mark chapter 3, we moved into that now. Verse 1 says, another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. And some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. Then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath to do, or to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. So here we are. Mark continues to tell another story from Jesus' ministry in Galilee. We know it's Galilee basically because verse 7 of Mark chapter 3 tells us that Jesus withdrew to the lake and a large crowd from Galilee followed him. So that's how we know that this story was from Galilee. during his ministry there. It's not mentioned what city, but that Jesus was teaching in a synagogue, which we know has been a thing he does when he goes to different locations. He would go to the synagogue first and teach. And so he's there teaching in the synagogue. And it's on the Sabbath, which, now, what are the rules of the Sabbath? Does anybody have any idea what the rules of the Sabbath are?
Day of rest.
Day of rest, okay. Huh?
You're not allowed to cook or anything.
Not allowed to do any kind of work. In fact, all the preparation, I think, for meals and stuff had to happen the day before for the Jews.
You can only travel so far.
It's a mile round trip. The Jews could only travel a mile round trip on the Sabbath. Could do nothing but rest that day. That was the whole purpose of the Sabbath. So basically, they would travel to synagogue and back. That'd be all the travel they did. They would eat, they would prepare they had already had the food prepared. They'd put it out, eat, do what they needed to do there. But it was a day where there was very little activity would go on in their life. The Jewish leaders took this to the nth degree. And to a point, it became more of a legalistic type thing as opposed to it being a rule of God that we're following. And, we can do that with about anything. Legalism is a big problem in the church, has always been a big problem in the church, because you do have those who are self-righteous, who think that they have to control everything. And legalism becomes a problem because, years ago, Pentecostal churches would tell people in the church they couldn't have a television in their home. Now, everybody in here is going to hell if that was the case. And our Pentecostal churches as a whole, although now it's not that way, you have more of the holiness group and things of that nature that are this way. But Pentecostal churches as a whole, that would be the Assemblies of God, the Church of God, all of those. No jewelry, no makeup, had to have your hair long. As women, men, you had to be, dressed within a decency, and no hats and things of that nature in church, and a lot of different things that would go on. And I'm not putting any of those brothers and sisters down who are still in that kind of a thought process, but the reality is that becomes more a legalistic way of controlling individuals at times. And so as a result of that, when we find ourselves controlling, they're trying to keep them from going off into the world. Listen, I can't stop you. I will preach to you. I will pray for you. I'll rebuke you. But I cannot stop you. If you're going to step across that line and walk your way into the world and do the things the world is doing, there's not a thing I can do to stop you. And there ain't no rules in this world that's going to put you in check. Only the Holy Spirit can do that. And sometimes we use those things. Well, that's what they had done. This had become a legalistic way of controlling the people, and there was a lot of laws and things that they did to try to control the people with. There were some in the crowd that were looking for a reason here to accuse Jesus. And they've already taken these opportunities they don't like some of what he's doing because, he's already done some things that have been a little controversial. And most of these are religious leaders. And I'm sure there were some who have kind of followed along because, usually somebody like that gets a following of their own, And there was a man with a shriveled hand there. And they were waiting. Some of this crowd was waiting for an opportunity to find Jesus doing something he shouldn't do. And those who wanted to accuse him watched to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. And I was reading this and I was thinking, they saw the man with the shriveled hand and thought, okay, Jesus is going to heal on the Sabbath and then we've got him. But I don't think that was about the man with the shriveled hand. I think it was in general that his ministry had been healing and they were waiting for him to actually cross that line. The man with shriveled hand happened to be the one that Jesus picked out of the crowd, and he said, so because it was a regular part of Jesus' ministry, they were just sitting there waiting for the moment to jump on him, pounce on him. Now, keep in mind, Jews were not allowed to work on the Sabbath. They could only travel a mile on the Sabbath. The scribes and Pharisees would also look at healing on the Sabbath as work. That would be their thought process. And Jesus knew that those who were trying to trap him were there, and he just rips the Band-Aid off. Calls the man up with shriveled hand, comes up, tells him to come up there. And then he asked them. They haven't even spoken. They're just thinking. And he asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath to do, good or evil? Which is lawful to do, to save or to kill? Which one of those would you consider the right thing to do? They wouldn't answer it because they were trapped. They kept their mouth shut. They were trapped. And in verse 5, it says, he looked around at them in anger. Now, listen, there is a righteous anger. There is time that it is okay to be angry. And I can tell you that Christ was never out of control with his anger. You might think he was whenever he went with a whip and threw the money changers out of the temple, but he was in control then. He took time to make the whip. So let's just be honest here. He was thinking about what he was doing. He wasn't just doing it out of spite. So he looked around at them in anger. He's deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. That's what he's angry at. And Jesus asked the man to stretch out his hand. And as he did, his hand was completely restored. Well, the Pharisees then were upset because, one, they couldn't say nothing now because Jesus had already made a big deal about it and asked them which one was lawful. So then that kind of put them in the corner and they couldn't really say a whole lot. And so as a result, they got upset and they went and plotted outside. They plotted outside to figure out a way to kill Jesus. Now, it says they plotted with the Herodians. The Herodians were, there were basically three political sects or leadership sects in the Jewish groups. You had the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and then there were the Herodians. The Herodians were supporters of Herod. And they actually had some power over the people because of that. They were likely a political group that supported him. The two groups, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, did not get along with the Herodians because they supported Herod. Herod was not a favorite of the Jewish people because he was put in place basically by the Roman government. They didn't like him. And so the two groups didn't get along. So it became the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. So they teamed up with the Herodians and they're like, we're going to figure out a way to get rid of Jesus. He's too much of a threat to us right now. And Herod didn't want him around either because he was having a major impact in society. And in the community. So, he was a threat to him as well. The controversy didn't stop or slow the ministry of Christ down, though. In Mark chapter 3, verse 7 to 12, it says, Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. And when they heard about all he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the region across the Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon. And because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him to keep the people from crowding him. For he had healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Whenever the impure spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." But he gave them strict orders not to tell others about him. Now, John mentions some controversies during Jesus' ministry, and he speaks specifically to those at times he is in Jerusalem. Here, we're still seeing everything is going on in Galilee. And Jesus is here in Galilee in Mark chapter 3, and he is ministering, and he's left the synagogue, he's gone out to the lake to get away from everything, and a large crowd follows him. What we said last week is at this point in time, Jesus is pretty much inundated with people because of the ministry he has done. And it got to the point even that they were crowding him so much because even him touching somebody was enough for them to be healed. So the crowd, those who had diseases were pushing forward to touch him. So he was getting crowded. So pretty much they were pushing him into the lake. So they get in a boat and get out away from the crowd so that they can continue to speak and he can do what he's got to do. And of course, it talks about the miracles that Jesus was performing in such a way that, I mean, it's just mind-boggling. He's here and people are being healed and demons are being demon-possessed are being delivered, and it's all happening, and there's not really much effort seems to be going on there because of the power of God. So whenever all this happened, he still gives them strict orders not to tell. And so now we're going to get into a little bit more of the controversies. John mentions other controversies. We'll talk about those next week. But in John chapter 5, verses 10 through 18 and 19 to 47, those are in Jerusalem and possibly in Galilee. But Matthew chapter 12 notes never mind, I'm going to have to stop right there because my thoughts are not good there. I don't have them consistent here. I got to go back and fix that paragraph. But anyway, we see that Christ's impact is major. He's not just healing people, he is impacting society as a whole. And that was the whole point. He didn't come in silent. He didn't come in quiet. He came in basically like a bull in a china shop. And he did that because he had a mission. That mission was what God sent him to do. And he had a short period of time to do it. Church, we need to be that centered with the purpose of ministry that God has sent us to do. And the call that he's called us to do. Any questions or comments?
Would teaching and preaching be considered work on the Sabbath?
You know, and that's a good question. And I have to go back and look a little bit closer at that. There had to be an allowance for it, obviously, because they did. I would have thought it would have some, but there's probably some allowance for that amount of work in the law. Now, you got to keep in mind, these laws were not, all of them were not God-based. They were man-based. So, you know, even although there is some of it that does come from the Mosaic law, there is the letter of the law, and then there is the spirit of the law. There's a whole purpose. The reason why the law is there is to guide us, and also show us where we're failing, so that we can straighten our lives up. But the problem is that instead of just understanding the spirit of the law, the Pharisees had gone beyond that they were just taking the letter of the law at face value, and there was no give or take. You know, and even it talks about, you know, being an ox if you have an ox in the ditch, okay, fine. If you got an ox in the ditch, you're going to have to pull him out on the Sabbath. That's going to be work, but you got to pull him out. You can't just leave him there to die. Those kinds of things. So there is that spirit that goes along with the letter of the law. And I think there's probably was some allowances in the Jewish legal system to allow that. I don't know the details on that, and then have to go back and look at that to give you any solid answer on it. Somebody didn't put their phone on do not disturb.
That does that a lot.
Anybody else? Anybody? All right then, y'all dismissed. We'll see you at church.
To answer your question, running